Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Dry Basements, a Builder's Success Story, with today's speaker, Gord Cooke. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar, which is part of our new learning series, Building Science Deconstructed, which is aimed at providing the industry with education focused on better building practices, technology, and building science. My name is Marcus Jablonka, and I work for Dorken as Vice President of Operations and Marketing. Dorken, for those of you who don't know us that well, is a manufacturer that makes a number of high-performance products for the construction industry. Amongst them are drain boards for foundation walls, air and water resistive barriers, rain screens, roof underlayments, and a number more. Our company was founded in 1892 in Germany, and it still has its international headquarters there. The North American headquarters of the Dorken Group is in Canada, just an hour outside of Toronto. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Gord Cooke. He will be presenting the webinar. Gord is a professional engineer. He has more than 25 years of experience in the low and high-rise residential building industry. He is a consultant, an author, an educator, and also a sought-after presenter who has a unique talent for taking building science issues from the field and presenting them in a pragmatic, understandable, real-world manner. Gord has particular expertise in applied building science, in energy efficient and high-performance housing, in innovative HVAC systems, and in indoor air quality. He is a certified instructor for EBA, the Energy and Environmental Building Alliance, and Dorken is a proud partner of EBA, which has provided the most trusted resources for building science information education in the construction industry for over 35 years. Gord is also a partner with Construction Instruction, as well as president of Building Knowledge Canada, and he also runs his own company where he's president of Air Solutions Inc. He has won the Excellence in Building Legacy Award, and he was honored as a Hall of Fame inductee in 2007 by Inequality Corp and the Ontario Home Builders Association. Joining Gord today on the panel as a guest builder will be David Brix from Terra Custom Homes. David is the president at Terra and has spent 25 years with the company. He is Canadian, grew up in Guelph, Ontario, and still resides there today. He currently serves on the Net Zero Council of Canada and has 10 years experience on the board of directors for the Guelph Development Association. David is also a former board member of Build Green Canada. Terra Custom Homes is a local developer and builder of net zero ready communities. Just a quick remark on questions. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please utilize the Q&A function. You'll find the Q&A button in the control bar. If you click on that, you can type out your question there. We will try to get to it during the presentation if time allows. And other than that, we're going to get to it during the Q&A section at the very end. And in case you miss anything, we will do a recording and we'll make that accessible to everyone who is attending today as well. With that, I would like to thank Gord and David. We're excited to have you with us today. We now look forward to your presentation on Dry Basements, a Builder Success Story. And again, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marcus. Nice to see you. Of course, you and I know each other about 20 years. So thanks for this opportunity, specifically on behalf of EBA, as you said, Energy Environmental Building Alliance out of Minnesota that I've been training for across North America. Quite frankly, we do about 25, 30 sessions a year, and we often see you with that. And David, you and I have known each other about 20 years as well as a builder in Guelph. How would you like to say good afternoon?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, that is true. I think actually probably is longer than 20 years. Excuse my dogs barking in the background. Can you see me? It appears as though
yes.
My camera's frozen.
No, we can see you.
Okay. Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. And Heather, we had a little poll to start. Can you show us the results of the poll? Oh, nice. So 47% architects and specifiers. That's cool. And a whole bunch of other. When the heck that is? We should have asked, I guess. We should have had more categories. Hopefully those weren't somebody phoning into a baking show or something like that. But we'll get started. Perhaps that's contractor. So I will try to gear my comments, I guess, towards that architectural market. Well, we'll work on that. So thanks very much for the opportunity. I'll just share my screen now, Heather, if you can give me permission to do that. There we go. Hopefully everybody's okay. Maybe Marcus, can you give me a bit of a nod? We've got the screen up, or David, perhaps. Great. Thank you. So I'll just do a few slides, and then I'd like to get David involved a little bit, because this session was specifically about the experience that builders are having with respect to basements, foundations, if you will. So we're going to concentrate specifically on that below grade space, if you will, that hole in the ground. This is part of, we just kind of borrowed the foundation module, part of that full day that we do with the EBA group, and that too will be online. EBA, just on the screen there, is hosting, each year they have a 3-day summit that they host, which is in cooperation with the latest research from DOE. That is, of course, has been announced as virtual. I shouldn't say of course, but it has been announced as virtual over the week of September 29th to October 9th, a series of seminars. And I just ask you to watch for that. And as Dorken, a proud sponsor of that, is where we want to go. EBA does have a bunch of national sponsors, national partners, and Dorken being one of those. I'll just leave that on the screen just quickly so you have a sense of who else is bringing you that information from EBA's perspective. In terms of today's agenda, what I really wanted to get across was this idea of new expectations of basements and foundations. It's a relatively new concept in housing for us to live in holes in the ground. I often joke, it took man about 200,000 years to get out of caves. And now in the last 40 years, we want to live back inside of holes. And that presents a bunch of challenges for us. And David's got some really good experience on that. I'll touch on the building science associated with that, although Dorken's already presented some great series with you with my partner, Justin Wilson, Joe Stiebrich, John Straub, who've probably delved deeper into the science. I just want to make sure the science, that we get some of the practicalities of that, some of that science. And then we're going to ask David to talk about some of the solutions that are cost-effective, durable, healthier, and safe, and think about some of the experiences we've had. I always love this phrase. It's a phrase we use in the EBA sessions all the time. The phrase from Sam Levinson, the American humorist, who said, "You got to learn from mistakes of others. You can't possibly live long enough to make them all yourself." And there's specifically 2 jurisdictions in North America that we can look forward to or look to with respect to basements. One of those is Minnesota, and the other is Ontario, Canada, which I happen to be from, and that's where David is from as well. We both live and work out of that market. And not surprisingly, not just coincidentally, the University of Minnesota and the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Canada, did a joint basement study a number of years ago, late 90s, to help us with this concept of basements. And so 2 different outcomes out of that. Well, I would say similar science, but a couple of different outcomes out of that. David, I think you might have to go on mute just so we don't get feedback while I'm speaking, if you wouldn't mind. And then I'll call on you when we need you. Thanks for that. Appreciate that. So I'm going to use that phrase, let's learn from the mistakes of others as we move through this. So here's your challenge right now. Do you recognize this basement? More importantly, can you smell this basement right now? This is, David, I'm going to bring you back up. You and I were chatting about this. Does this look anything like the basement you and I grew up in, would you say?
Yes, that's pretty much it, exactly. Built in the 70s.
Built in the 70s, that classic old paneling. The good news is it had materials like wood paneling, which weren't as susceptible to moisture, say, as drywall. But this is not David's basement. This is actually a basement that was part of a huge mold study, asthma, and the effects of mold on asthma study done in Canada. And in this household, there was folks who, specifically a young woman who had serious asthma issues, ended up in the hospital about 6 times a year. And, one of the strong cues on whether the house was affecting her was the strong odor out of this basement. And I often get this question about, or at least I ask builders the question, So why do we finish basements? And the answer is always, well, it's cheap living space. But when you think about the words that describe the atmosphere in old basements, I think you'd agree with me that most basements are cold, damp, dark, and musty. And so if we're going to build basements that are warm, dry, bright, and comfortable, then we have to do something a little different. And so what we need to imagine ourselves is in the early 70s, late 70s, whatever, we started finishing basements as living space, and it wasn't particularly successful. So architects on this call, if you are designing a house and you know that either the basement's going to be finished as part of the build, or if the basement's going to be finished thereafter, sometime thereafter, then we have to rethink about the expectations of how those basements are going to work. That's really what it's about. And I always like to challenge, why do we dig the hole in the first place? Fundamentally, why in northern climates we dig a hole? They certainly don't do that in the south. And the answer, of course, is to get the stable soils, to get the soils that aren't affected by frost. In effect, simplified if you will, all we're really doing is digging a hole deep enough that when we backfill, we are using the dirt as an insulator against the footings, the frost protection of the footings. And if you think about that, if I'm digging down 5 feet, for example, that means I'm protecting the footings with 5 feet of insulation called dirt. And dirt has an insulation value of roughly R2 per foot. Okay, so if I have 5 feet of dirt, I'm protecting the footing with R10 of insulation. So the fact of the matter is we could stop digging holes in the ground if we wanted and simply start insulating our footings to R10 and not have to build a basement. But the nice part is if you do build a basement, there's this lower living area, this space that you might be able to use. Historically, we used it as storage space. Okay, that's a good start. Some would say in the Midwest, well, it's a good place to go in tornado warnings, so that's pretty useful. Now we're talking about it as new living space. And Dave, if I could bring you back in, let me ask you, do you finish basements in your market?
In our market, prices are very high. Affordability is a problem, and most of our buyers are looking for their basements to be finished as future apartment space. We probably finish about 10% of our basements, but almost all of them are prepped to be a basement apartment in the future. And it's clear that within a very short period of time of the owner taking occupancy, they're going to convert that into a finished space.
You would say, I think you'd agree with me, if there's a little bit of angst. You happen to know that within weeks of you selling the house, the weekend warriors with the beer and the pop and the brother-in-laws are coming to finish that basement in a semi-professional manner, hopefully semi-professional manner. Does that give you any angst?
Well, of course it does. If we haven't made sure that we're not allowing moisture into that basement, then we're going to be on the hook for it as a builder, regardless of who finished it.
And thank you for understanding that and for mentioning that. You and I chat about this all the time, that no matter what happens in that basement, no matter what they do with it, it's still, they consider it your fault. Clearly the guy at Home Depot that told them what materials to use knows more than you do. So, they're not necessarily going to listen and say, and to your advice. So that's an interesting concept. Thank you. And you mentioned the critical key factor was the understanding that it is challenging below grade. Moisture is present. All soils everywhere are wet, and insects are close by, and the soil gases can enter. And of course, you've got cooler surfaces. Imagine that. You have higher moisture content and you have cooler surfaces. Both lead to extraordinary moisture challenges in basements, relative humidity, capillary flow, and so on. And we do need to understand that we're using a building material that wicks water. It's a great building material, concrete, wonderful building material. It stays strong even when it gets wet. And in the old days when we didn't finish a basement, the fact that the concrete was wet didn't bother us, quite frankly. It dried to the inside. So there's the third element. One, we are in wet soils. Two, the surfaces are cool. And three, we're using building materials that wick water. And four, they used to be able to dry the outside into the inside. And now when we put fixes on the inside, we restrict the drying potential. So moisture challenges, and that's really the premise for this call and this webinar, and for those on the calls, to remind yourself that basements have changed. The expectations and the physics of basements have indeed changed. So therefore, foundations are extremely challenging. And Then we need to think about the expectations. I just love that picture of that basement on the right. That's what everybody aspires to. That's what they imagine their basement's going to look like. High ceilings, lots of lighting. Look at the difference in floor finishes. Look at the ceilings. Lots and lots of finished goods down here, very high end. All of these, of course, highly subject to moisture that we need to worry about. And of course, people want them to be warm, dry, bright, healthy, usable. I always said as a kid, my mom and dad built the house in '54, didn't finish the basement until about 1972. As kids, we ran around there, shot hockey pucks and that kind of thing. After they finished the basement, we actually never really used it anymore because it went from this really nice play space, almost indestructible play space, to a space that was cold and damp. And they really didn't get good use out of it, or we didn't get good use out of it. So that's pretty powerful. So Heather, we do have a little poll. We wouldn't mind hearing from folks. It's going to take about 40 seconds or so. David, maybe you and I can banter while people answer. Heather, if you could put up the poll, and what percentage of projects that you're working on are the basements finished as some sort of living space? Can we get that up, Heather? I'm not sure if you guys are seeing the poll or not.
Yes, it was up, Gord.
Oh, great. Thank you. So just go ahead and do that. So David, you said a lot of people interesting in your market, Kitchener-Waterloo market, which is a university town. Everybody's looking at rental accommodations or apartment space in those basements. Is that what you're hearing?
Yes, a large number of them are looking at it as an income source. There's a fair number also that are multi-generational homes. Again, to be able to make it affordable, you have the parents or the grandparents moving in with the family who bought the house, and obviously they've contributed to the ability for that family to own that home.
And that means extra occupancy load, right? We're not just talking about occasional use, going to watch TV like you and I might have done as kids or play records down there. Now you have families living down there. So now we got bathrooms, showers, all of those kinds of things going on as well.
Oh, certainly. The basements, when we do finish them, they're complete with bathrooms. And if they're going to have an accessory apartment, they even have a separate laundry down there as well.
And tell me about the level of finishes that you're putting in. Are we drywall, fully drywall ceiling?
Whenever we finish a basement, it's completely drywalled. The entire ceiling is drywalled, as are all the walls.
And again, from a building science perspective, yet another complexity. That drywall is highly susceptible to moisture. It's like pablum for mold growth. I love drywall. There are some great drywall materials out there, like Den's Armor, that are fiberglass-based mats, so that they're paperless drywalls. So that's a better choice. So hopefully, Heather, we got the results of the poll?
Yeah, we have the results up.
I can't see them. Can you help me with those?
Yeah, no, I can't see them either.
I see them here, Gord, so I'll just read them out to you.
Thank you.
Around 28% are working on finished basements less than 15% of the time. 15% are working on finished basements 15 to 25% of the time. 15% are working on it 25 to 50% of the time. 16% 50 to 75% of the time, and 27% more than 75% of the time. So we have a good spread, but pretty much everybody is working on finished basements every once in a while.
Thank you. And thank you for that, Marcus. Appreciate that. For those who maybe had a little trouble hearing, it sure sounds like the vast majority of you on this call are considering that as livable space. And I just want to challenge you. We need to go from cold, damp, musty, to warm, dry, bright, healthy, and livable. And we are living in holes in the ground. That's what we need to think about as we go through this. And so if we connect that, if we think about the fundamentals of building science, heat, air, moisture flow, it's really first and foremost, and in fact, 90% of the battle is moisture flow. If we can solve the moisture issues, get it as dry as, let's say, above grade, then we can do things with it for heat, for energy flow from an energy perspective, insulation, and so on. But it's first and foremost about moisture. And just to remind yourself that from a building science perspective, that moisture comes in three forms: solid, liquid, and vapor. And we're most interested in liquid form. That is, we don't really care about the ice and snow until it melts. We don't really care about the water vapor until it condenses. It's about liquid water flow. And in basements, we have obviously extraordinary amounts of moisture sources that come to us from the ground soils, grading, below grade, and so on. So we have to think about all three of those elements and what that means to the liquid water flow potential in a basement. And so liquid water in liquid form is clearly the most concerning. And then in terms of moisture mechanisms, moisture flow, the order of magnitude, if it will, is water in gravity form. That is rain and liquid water flow, drainage away. Second is capillary flow for our Canadian friends, water wicking up from the ground. Third on the list is airflow, and fourth is vapor diffusion. In basements, what we really need to think about is that liquid water flow and the capillary flow, water wicking up through those building materials from those damp soils into the basements. And understanding that we have reduced drying potential in basements, we have to do a better job to make sure we don't have that capillary flow and to make sure that we are managing that liquid water flow in those basements, if you will. So liquid flow is still the most concerning. And so if we're going to manage water, and we are going to manage water, it's got to be from the ground up. This is from the EBA Water Management Guide, originally drawn by Joe Stebrick. But just imagining ourselves getting a lot of water away from the foundation. And we actually know the number. We want that grading and slope. Ideally, we know we'd like to get water 10 feet away. The downside to that is, or the challenge of that is, how do we get that water that far away from the building, especially in the below grade portion? So we really need to encourage good drainage of liquid water to get away from that basement. I just thought I'd show you a quick graphic from construction destruction in terms of capillary flow. And I just wanted to show you the elements, if you will, or how quickly moisture can flow. So if you think about concrete and wood and how quickly they can absorb moisture, two of the basic building materials that we use in basements, that concrete in as little as 2 hours have wicked water up in excess of 2 to 3 feet. In wood, it's going to take longer for that same 2 to 3 feet, in the order of a couple of days. And it's really just a function of the pore size, the pore diameter. And notice here that at a 1/4 of an inch air gap, a 1/4 of an inch space, there's virtually no capillary flow. So imagine concrete has these incredibly small, really consistent pores. They wick water up literally thousands of feet. Wood has larger pore sizes and maybe a few hundred feet. But all we need to do to stop water from wicking up is to get a capillary break of about a 1/4 of an inch. And that's pretty vital when you think about drainage materials, the kinds of materials that you want to use in order to stop that capillary flow. And so I just wanted to mention capillary flow. It's not really the focus of this particular seminar, but are we thinking about, because of the footings themselves up into the concrete wall, this is a really cool little product called Delta Footing Barrier. Marcus, if you're there, this was a product you guys brought around late 90s, as I recall. Was it not?
It was after we introduced the dimple sheet technology here in North America. So I would roughly guess around 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. You know, we identified this as an issue in some buildings, and immediately Dorken came to the fore and said, I think we got something for you. Here's just a little animation of how that's going to play for you. The footings going down. It's a very simple application. David, I don't know, have you tried this product before? I should put you on the spot, but have you tried this?
No, we haven't, Gord. I know that products like that exist, but we have not used it. No.
Fair enough. I've used it in a couple of projects with a builder that I'm using, and he's found it so easy to apply. It's just troweled on the time that the footings are wet, so the time of pour, just after a pour, and we can install it either with keyway or with rebar to maintain that slip, or anti-slip plane, if you will. But just a simple way of stopping the capillary flow that otherwise, again, historically, that water wicked up from the footings up into the foundation. It could dry to the inside. Boy, now we're putting finishes on those walls. We don't want it drying to the inside. So let's stop that moisture flow before it gets started. So that's just the capillary flow that we wanted to think about. And then, of course, it is about good drainage. I show this picture because this was a two families that I happen to know that were having moisture problems in their basement. They both realized it was all about drainage. So they got together, dug out this really nice, deep French drain, I would call it, and actually dug underneath the the sidewalk to get it out to the street level. So that was after the fact, just a couple of folks working together. It's always about grading and drainage. So there's no substitute for grading and drainage, except we still have lots of moisture in the soils. So now we have to do an even better job. And so, David, you and I, let's chat a little bit about your experience. Do you recall when you first started using drainage on the outside of your basement walls?
Yeah, when I started with Terra 25 years ago, it was a company that was roughly 5 years old. And for the first, I'd say 5 years I was with them, we were just using what we called the fuzz.
The fuzz, which is the one on the right you see.
It's called DrainClad, I believe. Yeah, that product.
It was at the time.
And that was our standard building practice. When we discovered Delta MS, we were offering it as an option. And we recognized what a superior product it was over the DrainClad. So we actually, if someone didn't opt to purchase it, we sort of accidentally finished their foundation with that, because we found that whenever we had leak calls, it was always the houses that hadn't previously upgraded to the Delta product.
Thank you. And I'll give you guys a bit of a story here. It was around the time David came into with TerraView into the industry. You guys wouldn't necessarily know this, but we had a government change in 1995. Part of that government change, the promise they made was affordability of housing and more housing units or dwelling units. And one of the things they said is therefore we should change the building code to make basements into livable space so that people could indeed rent out basements as apartments or bring in multi-generational families. The builders at that time said, geez, you can't do that because basements leak. And we have tremendous problems if we finish a basement. And so the government instituted the requirement for drainage layers. And that's when Marcus and I first met. Dorken came to the table and said, here's a great drainage layer. So the building code said, okay, then we'll mandate drainage layers and put them into the code. 3 years later, another government changed. Those rules were taken back out of the code. But much like you just heard David say, all builders maintained the drainage mats of some description. And as you heard, David's experience was, we could use an insulating product. The appeal of the product on the right is it's simultaneously drainage, but it also gives insulation. There's some debate over that. How well does it drain and how well does it insulate if indeed it's wet? And so we would say separate out those functions. Remember the wicking, the capillary flow. What was the size of the gap that was needed to stop the capillary flow? Well, in fact, that was 1/4 of an inch. And in fact, if you look at the dimple on the dimple drainage mat, the Delta MS, Peter, I'll let you answer. Sorry, Marcus will let you answer. What is the depth or the thickness of that gap?
So the dimple height itself is 8 millimeters. So you end up with around 8 millimeter of free space. The product itself is slightly thicker than that, but it goes beyond the space that you showed before that allows no capillarity anymore.
So we're using English, we're using metric or imperial and metric. 8 millimeters is roughly just under 3/8 of an inch.
It's a bit over 1/4 of an inch. Yeah.
Yes, between 1/4 and 3/8, right? Yeah, so thank you. And I just wanted to verify that. Sorry to put you on the spot. But this idea that I can stop that capillary flow. So not only does it give me great drainage, it also stops capillary flow from coming back up, which I'm not sure you could guarantee with the drainage mat. But really, to the point, David, I think you would agree with me, and I'll ask you the question bluntly. I know that you, for the last 20, 25 years, you guys have built in the range of 50 to 80 houses a year. What's been the experience in terms of drainage, in terms of basement leaks? How many basements do you now have leaks?
Well, as I said, once we decided that we were going to make it a standard, as opposed to sort of trying to upsell people, we have not experienced any basement leaks at all while using this product. It's amazing at keeping the moisture away from that concrete.
And that's really the key, right? It's not, some would say, and we need to ask the question, well, we'll show the slide in a moment and how it's applied, but it's really pretty magical. The concrete's still going to crack. Okay. The concrete's going to crack, but the water's not going to come into the basement. It's stopping that hydrostatic pressure against the wall, and it's just making it really easy for water to go down. So as a building scientist, drainage is your friend. it's always about drainage. It's one of the 4Ds of water management. In today's world, architects, you guys would understand vented rain screens. 47% of the people on the call were architects and specifiers. Undoubtedly, you've heard the term vented rain screen. That's an air gap of at least 3/8 of an inch. And here we are mimicking that in the below grade to make sure that water runs downhill. So just an interesting experience from that perspective. And David, I thought we would just play a little animation of how it's installed, and I would just ask you to speak to what's been your experience. Who's actually doing the installation in your case?
We have a separate contractor, Denrick is their name, but they do all the foundation prep for us after the forming contractor has left. So they do the drainage tile, they do the Delta MS, they do tar behind it. In our market, we have radon, and so it's a requirement of the building department that we actually seal the foundation with tar before we put the Delta on. And then they basically put the gravel in around the weeping tiles, and we backfill.
And so that's interesting. It's not the foundation contractor. The foundation contractors come, he's set up his forms, he stripped the forms, off he goes, and then presumably let it sit a couple of days, or how long are you letting that sit before you apply the drainage?
Yeah, you're right. It is a couple of days.
So let it set a couple of days, and then they're coming in. You'll see here, just scribing that off to make sure it's nice and level. That's an interesting detail there to make sure it wraps over. Sometimes we see builders just drop to the bottom of the top of the footing, to the top of the footing, and it really should extend out over the footing to get that water pre-drainage out across the top of that footing. There you're seeing the attachment methodology. This is an animation that's been drawn on for Dorken. Just take away that language barrier in terms of installation. A sealant at the top, you just don't want dirt and so on getting down in behind. You're not that worried about water behind there. It's free drainage, but it's just that you don't want it filling with dirt. So there is a cap on the top of that would make that work. And you'll notice it's just going to grade or just below grade, so that it's not visible when you're done. And I suspect to most on this call, that's probably pretty familiar. On vertical seams, we're just going to overlap and seal those, again, with the fasteners in place. David, your experience, how long is this taking to install?
Well, they're very quick at it. Typically, the foundation prep is most part of a day, and as I said, then we move on to backfill.
And so we're this particular portion is less than a day, you're saying? So it's a couple hours to get this done?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple hours to get that done, and then backfill right away. Obviously, safety concerns in the hole, making sure that you've got lots of room down there. But otherwise, in really good shape, right? And now we can work our way around drops. We can work our way around windows, penetrations, and so on, and installing that mat. And that's powerful to me that this is, at least in our market, the Ontario market, this has become part of the construction industry. There are roughly, for those who don't know on this call, in the province of Ontario, Canada, roughly 40 to 60,000 houses built each year. And I think it's fair to say 80% are doing, at least 80%, probably more like 90%, are doing a drainage dimpled membrane. The fuzz, as you called it's kind of disappeared, David. Has that been your experience? Most builders, your competitors in your market, all doing this?
Yeah, I believe they've all learned from it. I don't see, when I drive around other sites, I don't see anybody who's not using a product like this or exactly this product.
And again, as a building science guy and as a indoor air quality fellow, for years I did indoor air quality investigations on behalf of our housing authority, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And inevitably, I ended up in moldy basements. Their stat was, this was a CMHC stat, 50% of basements across Canada have signs of moisture challenges, is I think the word we had to use, not issues, but challenges, 50%. And fully 25% of basements had enough mold in them to affect the health of children living in the building. So that was a CMHC study done in the mid-'80s. And inevitably, I ended up in a basement, and it was really powerful to know that, at least in our market, as of 1995, effectively all basements had this drainage layer. And there was a marked difference between houses built before 95 in terms of basements and houses built after 95. And some on this call are going to be renovators or remodelers going to go, well, What's on the outside of that basement wall? Well, frankly, you don't know. You would like to know what's there. Maybe you actually dig up a little bit to find out what's there, because you really wouldn't want to be finishing a basement unless you knew you'd solve the moisture issues. And this is such a valuable tool, the strategy, if you will, to solve that moisture issue. So knowing that basements are a challenge, knowing that people want to finish them, let's make sure we've solved that water management issue. And the nice part is, I'll just move on in terms of some of the science. The nice part is, once you've got yourself good water management, then you can start to think about better insulation. And I want to remind you that as you add insulation to any part of the building, you reduce the potential to get dry. So if I haven't handled the moisture in the basement and I start adding extreme amounts of insulation, now those building materials stay wetter much longer. So it's absolutely vital that we connect the idea of basement drainage with the concept of higher levels of insulation. I don't have a slide on it, but you need to know this. In northern climates, that is anything over climate zone 5, the heat loss in basements represents about 25% of winter heating loads in virtually every market. You go, that can't be. I thought heat rises. Heat doesn't rise, warm air rises. Heat moves from hot to cold. And because concrete is such a poor insulator, we have a significant amount of heat loss through the basement slabs, through the basement walls, which really can't be solved until I make sure I've got moisture. So the connection here in our code in 1995 was, we're going to require full height basement insulation so that basements are living space. And if we're going to require full height basement insulation, then we need to make sure that we have good water management. That's when drainage layers came in. David, back in the day, you would have basement leaks and you would call the polyurethane injection folks. I don't even see them in the yellow pages in our market anymore. You had said you haven't seen any leaks in 20 years. I don't even think those guys are in business anymore, from what I can tell.
No, there are the crack filling guys. They exist.
Yeah.
I've certainly directed friends and family who live in older homes to them because they've experienced a crack and water penetrating the basement.
Right, fair enough. So in older basements, maybe still around. So that's cool. And so of interest, and I mentioned earlier Minnesota versus Canada in terms of, or at least Ontario, Canada, in terms of basement experiences. In Minnesota in 2014 said enough, no more insulation to the inside of basement walls. That is, they were not convinced that they could solve the moisture issues in basements. So they simply said, put your insulation to the outside. So that is a more or less, it is a code requirement. The strategies that used in Minnesota, they start with insulation on the outside. If you want to insulate on the inside, you can, but you first have to show you've insulated on the outside, which of course begs the question, and Marcus, if you wouldn't mind back on the line, if I'm going to insulate on the outside, and I would love you to do it, where would you put the drainage layer? That is, with insulation, do you still need drainage? I'm going to answer that and say yes. Where do you prefer the drainage layer to be, the drainage mat?
So there's two schools of thoughts. I'll mention them both first before giving my personal opinion or recommendation. One is you certainly want to drain the water in a layer where it keeps the sensitive part dry, which is the wall itself, so that the interior of the basement doesn't get wet anymore. So from that perspective, it would be best to keep the drainage layer close to the exterior surface of the concrete wall, meaning inboard of the insulation material. Another school of thought would be to have the drainage layer outboard of the insulation material, because, well, you still have the drainage, and secondly, you also keep the insulation material dry. Now, depending on the type of insulation material used, the insulation material may not mind getting wet. So if it's extruded polystyrene, for instance, it doesn't matter all that much. But even there, some insulation experts will say, well, over time, it can still absorb some moisture and therefore lose some R value. I think ultimately both will work. What I would recommend to do, or if it were my own house, I would do the following. If I'm limited to using the product that you have shown earlier on, the Delta MS, I would put it directly over the concrete wall, meaning inboard of the insulation. If I can do a little upgrade to that, there's a very similar product. It's called Delta Drain. It's basically the same as the Delta MS, a dimple sheet, but it has a geotextile heat bonded to it. And I would use that, but outboard of the installation. And we have fastening methods for that as well. That way you get a very reliable way of drainage. You keep your installation dry and protected as well during backfill, and you get kind of the best of both worlds.
And I'm with you on that. One, it can be done either way. I personally like the drainage layer tight to the concrete wall. We sometimes get asked, well, there's an air gap there. Is that causing convective loops? Not a significant convective loop. It's not reducing the potential R value in that application. So we like to see the drainage layer between the concrete and the insulation, whatever that insulation product might be. And there are mineral wool insulations that can be used there, EPS, XPS. They too, at the foot of those insulation products, should still be on good drainage. So gravel layers and so on underneath, or stone layers underneath. David, you're doing net zero communities. Are you doing insulation on the outside or the inside of that base wall?
It's all on the inside. I think, as you probably know, our standard is that we actually spray foam the gravel before the slab is poured. And while that they're spraying the gravel, they also spray the foundation wall on the inside and up into the ring joist. And then we frame within that.
And thank you for that. That's an interesting concept that'll show here in a slide in a second, at least the concept of that. So the idea here isn't just showing a piece on the right. This is a detail from DOE in the US, showing that waterproofing and that drainage mat, if you will, in this case showing it on the outside of the insulation, but it could be, as Marcus said, either. I should bring that up. David, you had said you apply a damp proofing first before you apply the dimpled membrane. You'd said that's partly a radon issue.
Yeah, but prior to that requirement by the city that we were building in, we were just applying the delta to the foundation wall. But now we have to tar before we add the delta onto the foundation.
And I am a believer. Go ahead, David.
It's really just a soil gas seal. It's a soil gas seal in that case.
Right. And I'm okay with that. I still like it as a capillary break, stopping that water wicking that might be in that wall. So I still like the damp proofing and then the MS over top, but it's not necessary. And what's really cool is you got a good building science partner in Dorken that can help you in your soil conditions, your marketplace. Do I need the damp proofing layer or not? So insulation on the outside is a great detail. We absolutely can insulate on the inside. And this is, again, a detail drawn by Joe Stieberk and his group at Building Science. This was the culmination of that work out of University of Minnesota and University of Waterloo that said, if we're going to insulate on the inside, first, let's insulate on the outside. But if we're going to insulate on the inside, let's use a foam-based product tight to the wall, a permeable or at least semi-impermeable product on the inside of that wall to stop any moisture that's in the concrete getting into that insulation. So a closed cell spray foam in your case, David, works, or an XPS foam works. And then by all means, just do all spray foam, but a spray foam is fairly expensive. In your case, you would finish off the cavity with fiberglass insulation. Is that right? Or a mineral wool?
Well, yeah, we have to use Rox wool because we have to protect that spray foam for fire spread.
And thank you for that. In fact, any foam you use back there in Canada specifically, the US would say you have some insulating products that are fire rated. In Canada, we're restricted. If we use a foam-based product in that foundation wall on the interior, you either need to cover it with drywall, and David's only covering or finishing 10-15% of basements. But the rock wool folks, the mineral wool folks have come to the table and said, hey, use our bad insulation, we'll get you the fire resistance that you need. So again, great experience, David. What level of insulation, are you using in a net zero ready application? What level of insulation are you using then in that wall?
We're spraying R5 against the foundation wall, as I said, and then we are putting R20 bats between studs at 24-inch on center.
And thank you for that very useful experience. So at net zero ready in our climate zone, an R25 nominal, it'll be almost that because of the insulation behind, maybe R22 effective R value, but an R25, you said 22 bat or 20 bat?
It's an R22, sorry.
22. So 27 nominal, which would be about a 23 to 24 effective R value. And that's getting that basement to net zero ready levels. And I suspect architects would be interested in hearing that if you are working with clients who want to get to net zero ready, That's the orders of magnitude that you need on that basement wall. Some would say, and I would say, do it on the outside, like in Minnesota. But if you are going to do it on the inside in any event, let's make sure that we have ourselves really well water managed walls. Again, I would say some would say, well, if you put that closed cell spray foam, there's no water getting in. And the answer is, yes, it is. Concrete cracks, even when you spray foam, there still could be water in that wall. I've seen it many, many times. It's drainage on the outside, regardless of what you're doing. This is just showing an animation of that, a really nice finished detail. This is one of the CI animations. So you've got your drainage on the outside. Here's a really good application to get insulated. And this is mimicking or mirroring what David was talking about. In his case, he's spray foaming the entire wall right up to the rim. This is just showing a sheet good product, but just showing that finished up. That gets you your air tightness out of that rim joist area or box joist area. And then we're just going to build the stud wall in front of that. And if, depending on your climate zone, and if you've done the math, you can actually show with that stud wall, in this case, we're showing a blown-in insulation. It wouldn't have to be. Bats are fine here too. In our market, in the Canadian market, it would have to be fire-rated unless you're drywalling. In this case, they're showing drywall. Of interest, perhaps, to folks on this call, this is the wall that you can show with the right amount of foam on the outside that is extruded, that you don't need a vapor retarder on that wall. That well, you don't need a vapor barrier, that you could use a vapor retardant paint. So you could eliminate poly in that basement. That's more of a Canadian thing. The US has pretty much gotten rid of poly in basement walls, good for them. But this is a fairly magical wall for the way it manages moisture. Anything that is in the concrete coming to the inside, and it's limited because you've put up good drainage, is first seeing that semi-permeable or impermeable foam, so it's staying in the concrete. So the moisture's in the concrete and the concrete doesn't mind. Any moisture that's coming from the house, vapor in the air, the first hard surface it's hitting is no longer the cold concrete, it's now the semi-warm foam. So this is a really good wall from a managing moisture perspective. I often get asked, and at the end of these calls, I get asked, what about ICF? And ICF is a tremendous basement strategy. Still needs to be water managed. And Marcus, I'm showing an older slide for purpose. This was a product that you guys made specifically for ICF, which was a translucent, transparent product so that they could see where their ties were. I don't think you make that product anymore, but the same principles apply. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct, yes.
So they got smarter at knowing where the ties were, and you don't necessarily need to make it translucent for them anymore. But it's really important for everybody on this call to understand that I don't care what you're using on that basement wall below grade, you still want drainage. ICF, poured concrete, certainly concrete block. Drainage is your friend. I don't know how many times I could say that and not be overplaying it, because drainage is so important to the long-term viability of those basements. And then I do get asked, and I thought I would just add a slide. Look at that same dimpled product that's now used on a floor. Don't look at the basement wall insulation. That's clearly not a great way to insulate a basement wall with a blanket with poly on it. But this is a basement floor. So if you don't know the conditions under the slab, then it's really powerful to put that same 3/8 of an inch gap. It gets you that capillary break. It gets you a little bit of airspace, and it gives you a venting opportunity. Obviously, if the basement floods, it's still going to get wet, but I have an opportunity to drain and dry that space out. So that's yet another cool application of that magical, and that's really the science, right? That magic of that 3/8, roughly 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch magic space is what we're talking about. What I love about this is when you've done this, and in the basements David's talking about, or in this basement, now you have flooring choices. I will give it to you this way. If you're struggling to find a budget to put in drainage and these kinds of materials, think about what the cost of the flooring materials are going to be. This is a fraction of the budget that you're going to spend on the floor materials themselves in basements. You know this, people immediately want to put carpets on basement floors. Why? Because the basement floor is cold. Not when you insulate them, not when you use these kinds of drainage materials. The basement floors are no longer cold and damp. So I can put carpets down. Better yet, I would think about, engineered floors and so on, but all of those still that option. So it's really powerful to understand that when you've got good moisture control, you've got great options. Now you don't mind spending more money on finishing of that basement. Now you absolutely can go ahead and put more insulation in your basement. That's, from my perspective, the science of this. Air, heat, moisture flow. When I've done moisture control, that gives, as architects on this call, gives you tremendous options. I'll go right back to that example of, we would always say to clients when we're doing indoor air quality investigations, do not finish basements as living space. That was the official CMHC, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, government crown corporation. Their advice was, do not finish basements as living space, with a little caveat, unless you know that you've got really good water management principles, like good drainage, insulation. Now you can go ahead and finish a basement. But even then, we would say, be careful with the materials you use. You would say use paperless drywalls as opposed to the regular drywalls, and you would not use carpet on basement floors. But when you have a fully water management foundation, now you have those choices of going back to drywall and so on. I do want to add one final little element. All basements, as good as you can make them, all basements need dehumidification. All basements in all markets. Architects on this call, put it on your plan somewhere. If you're showing a finished basement, shall include a standalone, or, well, in this case, it's a ducted dehumidifier. David, you built a house for my son, and when he moved in, you gave him a dehumidifier, as I recall.
A dehumidifier. I was just going to say, for years we gave our homeowners a sort of closing gift, and for a while it was a toolbox, blah, blah, blah. And then we came upon hey, why don't we give them a dehumidifier? Because we're recommending that they put one in their basement and run it continuously, especially for the first year while we're trying to dry the house itself out. And then we thought, well, why don't we just give it to them? And then we don't have to rely on them to install one.
And do you recall the number you told my son to set it at? In terms of percentage? Interesting enough.
Probably 60%.
It was less than 60, and you said, well, let's keep it at 50 just to be safe. You definitely want it under 60% RH. And typically, it's pretty cost effective to keep it under 50, 55%. I like the fact that you're putting in this case, you've offered a portable. I'm going to say to architects on this call and builders and so on this call, think about a ducted version. There's some great new options out there. A Train, for example, is a sponsor of the EBA sessions, and they offer these ducted versions. So fairly powerful. So the key experiences here are, and we're left with a little bit of a nice little piece of time, 7 minutes or so for some questions. Marcus, I think there was some chats there, some questions perhaps on the chat. Would you like to delve into those?
Sure. Yeah, I can throw a few of them towards you. One of them is, I think, going back to the earlier part of your presentation, when dealing with capillary flow from footer to foundation wall, my experience is that structural engineers will not allow the use of anything that breaks the bond between the footer and the concrete wall. Can you direct me to anything measurable that would help them to make the leap of faith?
Well, I will say, and then I'll push that back over to you guys. Maybe you could answer that one online and give them the official, your version of that. But you did notice on that slide that you used a keyway or you used a rebar situation to stop that potential slip. That said, I think you're going to be able to tell us, Marcus, that your product has been approved for that application. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so the building code for residential construction is pretty quiet in all areas in North America on that. So if there's a structural engineer involved, I think they do it based on their education, not so much based on code requirements. We have designed the product so that it is not slippery. It has a fuzzy fabric on the underside as well as on the top side. That is also for installation purposes, so it can bond to fresh concrete. It is also for safety reasons, so that workers on the job site are not falling or slipping over it. But then to really address the concern that structural engineers would have, we recommend one of two methods. One is the picture that you showed, or the animation that you showed actually showed dowels. So you would slit a little X into the top of the membrane after it has been installed on top of the footing, and push the dowel through and into the wet concrete below, into the concrete of the footing. So there's your structural connection from footing to wall. Another method, when steel reinforcement is not wanted or not used on those job sites, is to press a 2x4 into the surface after the membrane has been installed on the wet concrete of the footing. I believe you showed that also in the animation. So a 2x4 simply pushed into the top of the footing, similarly to what we see in many areas in North America already, where installers are doing that on a freshly poured foundation. That basically creates the mechanical connection between the wall and the footing, because the main pressure ultimately will come from the outside against the side or against the foundation wall. You want to have a mechanical connect there to the footing strip.
Wonderful. And was there another question that we could handle before I push one over to David?
Yeah, here's one. It's more common, but I think it's interesting perhaps for both of you to comment on. Someone says folks would prefer to do everything from inside of existing foundations. But I think you're saying that without exterior drainage, finished basements may fail, even if you have to excavate to install that drainage.
Right. And David, you're a new home builder. You guys haven't done renovations historically. But what are your thoughts there? How would you feel about finishing a basement? You said you've talked to family and friends. What's the advice you give them?
Sorry, you sort of broke up there for me, but obviously you want to keep the moisture from getting into that wall. So the best approach is that it's applied from the outside. Obviously, new home, you have the opportunity to do that before you backfill. With an existing home, I would think if you've got some serious issues with water penetrating your basement, you're going to have to go to the expense of excavating around to apply this product.
And thank you for that. And let me give you the CMHC, the indoor air quality approach that we take. I'll go right back to that basement that you saw that was involved in that asthma study. And I want to give you 3 key facts. First, a strong odor coming out of the basement. Second, somebody in the household who was very sick. Third, when the consultant came in to do the indoor air quality assessment, they detected higher levels of mold in the basement than upstairs. And actually that consultant got quite sick quite quickly because he happened to be sensitive to mold. Based on those 3 facts alone, we said the very first thing you should do is gut the basement. None of this, well, maybe I could spray or maybe I could clean or I could dehumidify. No, the answer was to gut the basement. The good news is that's only $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. It's actually cheaper than checking or testing for mold just to go ahead and fill a dumpster full of stuff. Second, we said to them, all right, let's make sure that you don't have moisture problems. And we test for moisture. And all you would do is take sheets of polyethylene, 3 foot by 3 foot, a meter squared. You tape them, seal them to the wall, one on all 4 sides on each exterior wall, and you put it at the level that transcends grade to just above, below grade to above grade, and you tape a couple on the floors, and you wait 1 spring season. You go, hey, I want to finish it right away. No, you should wait. And if you see moisture on the surface of that poly, that is the interior surface, you have high indoor relative humidity problems that frankly are pretty easy to solve, dehumidification. If you see moisture behind the poly, between the poly and the basement wall, now you have moisture problems in the wall. And at that point, we would say, people say, is there a sealer I can get? No, good luck, not going to happen. Then we would say, dig up on the outside. Now, you need to remind yourself, this is a client who 6 times a year, their daughter ended up in the intensive care unit. When you think about the $5,000 to gut the basement, and then you think about the 25 to 30 that it took, it was a relatively small house, 25 to 30,000 that it took to fix the basement on the outside, does that sound like money well spent? And the answer is, of course, in a heartbeat like that. The client said, of course, that's what I could do. In their case, those 2 things alone allowed them, and they just cleaned the basement, a super good cleaning of the house. The next year, didn't go to the hospital once. Now, she still had asthma and so on, the asthma attacks, but didn't go to the hospital once. And on that basis alone, they said, we don't really need that basement. They just turned it into, put some metal shelving up, put in some plastic tote bins, just and used it as storage. Didn't use it as living space. But once the foundation's been done on the outside, Marcus, good drainage layers and so on, you're going to say, what about the floor? Well, I can still use that Delta floor product. Now, when you know you've solved the moisture on the outside, the danger is the flip side of that is, I was with a client who'd done $120,000 basement renovation, $120,000 basement finishing, and 8 months later had to tear it all out and start again because they didn't solve the basement moisture problem. So that's a rather long piece of advice. My apologies for that, but that's the orders of magnitude, the orders of concern that you need to have with this issue. David, we should probably say goodbye. We're at 2:01. Marcus, Peter, Heather, thanks very much for the opportunity. If there are questions that I can answer online, let me know. I would just say to you on behalf of EBA and specifically on behalf of Dorken, thanks very much for your time today. And David, thanks for your experience.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gord, very much. And thank you, David, for joining us today, for allowing us to have this webinar also on behalf of EBA. Very much appreciate your help with this and your presentation and the discussion. I have a few slides here to just wrap up briefly and underline some of the points, Gord, that you made along the way in the presentation as well. We are evolving from using basements only for storage, and people want that space livable and finished and high-end and usable, and want to avoid these types of problems. If they are not as visible as they are in this picture, they might be noticeable as well, and none of that is pleasant and must be avoided. And the solution can be very easy, very simple. It's drainage that is the key. Anything that stops water is good. Anything that drains water away is better or superior, because it doesn't even allow the water pressure to build up against the wall anymore, find any cracks or imperfections that have occurred during the installation or perhaps even after, due to settlement cracks or damage during backfill or anything like that. One thing I want to point out, when comparing dimple sheets, something that makes this particular product, Delta MS, very special is, like everyone else, we do use recycle. However, we embed the recycled material between two virgin layers of plastic, simply for the reason that that way we can control its aging behavior much better, because a virgin is the virgin material, brand new plastic, is something we specify and we particularly choose by design to ensure that this product has a long lifespan ahead without degrading over time. If you were to use pure recycle, that is virtually impossible, because you get recycled quality of all kinds. It will certainly degrade much quicker. So we protect the recycle that we utilize by two thin virgin layers on the outside. And that makes this product very good for the environment. There are no VOCs in there, nothing contaminates groundwater. Nobody has to be concerned with regards to breathing protection during the installation. The product can be installed in any weather, very simple to do. And it comes with a bunch of accessories. It is obviously approved for use in all of North America with building code approvals, both CCMC in Canada and ICC approvals in the United States, and has been used by many builders and on thousands and thousands of homes. We have lots of technical resources, lots of support staff here as well on our team. If you want to get in touch with us, look us up on our website, dorken.com. You can also find on there information on who is in your area to connect with them directly, or you can just leave us a note on the website and we'll reach out to you. And with that, I'd like to point out some upcoming events as well under this educational series. One is a webinar in 2 weeks from today on June 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have Dr. Joe Stiebrick providing a webinar on rain screens, Vikings, and the evolution of protection. And there's also a new video feature coming up, A Cup of Joe. We see a few minutes of Joe talking about rain screens as well, and others to follow on air tightness and how low you can go. With that, thank you again, Gord. Thank you, Dave, for joining us today for presenting on this topic. Very much appreciated. Thanks to all our attendees. It was very nice to have you with us. All the best to you. Be safe, and we'll hopefully see you in 2 weeks again.
Thank
you,
you,
Marcus.